we're here on this planet to do something spiritual, psychological, emotional, creative, artistic. And so we kind of have a mission, and there's sort of things we need to do. And when we're born into this world, no one's ever going to get it perfect. And so when we start getting off course, symptoms, pain, difficulty are almost the signs that we're off course.
Coming all the way from Minneapolis to Washington, D.C., we now bring you Enter the Freud.
Warning, this podcast is for entertainment only and not intended for medical purposes. Listen at your own risk.
Well, okay. This is the midlife crisis episode, and how we should start, I don't know.
Well, as 40-somethings moving into later 40-somethings, we should know all about the midlife crisis from firsthand experience.
I need a coffee to help me out with this. But okay, Dave, would you do us the incredible favor of just letting us know what midlife crisis is?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Well, here's what it is not, is what everyone thinks it is, which is like, everyone thinks it's like some strange biological thing that happens to men in their early 40s where they want to like buy a convertible and worry about their appearance and maybe cheat on their wife and freak out and get really, it's like the common view of it is it's like the man goes through some weird, really immature thing. He has like a brief return to adolescence. That's kind of what I think most people think the midlife crisis is it's a brief return to adolescence in the early 40s, which I don't want to say there's no truth to that, but that's just like a really limited, poor understanding of what it is.
Right, and it's often referred to as kind of like a questioning of one's values, questioning of one's morality. That's really what, because when they look at what psychology is in a very poor estimation, they think psychology is values and morality.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So then, because someone starts to question their own sanity, perhaps, and so then they readjust their moral compass so that suddenly, an affair doesn't seem that bad, and then a sports car. And if I hear one more comparison to an affair and a sports car, I'm just gonna have to quit this conversation. Literally, that's what everyone says.
Right, and obviously there's some truth to that, but that's just such a limited, shallow understanding. Okay, so I'm gonna try to simplify. There's sort of a few different categories, so I'll just randomly pick one. First category, I have to start with this. There's a force in human psychology that's super powerful, and that really I don't think the world of psychology emphasizes it, or maybe they're not even aware of it as much as they should be. And that is humans, and maybe men more so than women, perhaps, but humans really need a goal to be focused on that inspires them and motivates them to get up in the morning and motivates them to like go out into the world with energy and inspiration and enthusiasm. We humans really, really, really need that. And psychology doesn't really talk about it. Man's Search for Meaning, I think by Viktor Frankl. That's one famous book that I can think that talks about it. Sort of. He talks about it, but he's not saying the exact same thing I'm saying. It's like, if I have something that when I wake up in the morning I'm like excited to do, then I can really recruit a ton of energy to like go out into the world. But if I don't have something, like I'm gonna be depressed or just like lethargic or disoriented or lost. So that's a super important key like fundamental root of human psychology, and I don't know why people don't get that as much. Okay, so that's essential, I think, to understanding what midlife crisis is. So you take that concept and then you add it to the common path of life of a average American in this day and age, and very simply put, our world gives us a bunch of unwritten rules or a script of like how a life is supposed to go. And you're supposed to grow up as a kid, go to school, get good grades, go to college, get good grades, get out of college, get a job, meet a woman, get married, buy a house, get a dog, get a picket fence, have a couple kids, and then when you've done that, you're done. The story ends there and you're supposed to live happily ever after. And at that point, which happens roughly the person has finished that script roughly in their early 40s, at that point, there's no one knows what the hell they're supposed to do in life anymore. It's like the story ends, and in the movies, it's like the movie ends and they drive off into the sunset. But the reality is human life, your life is just like half over at that point. So the next half of your life, it's like, what the fuck am I supposed to do? So you wake up in the morning and you don't know what the fuck to do. You have no goal, anything to motivate you or guide you or anything. And so you're just facing this vast abyss of directionlessness.
Yeah, I was reading someone's attempt to explain this phenomenon this morning, and they had a similar take of yours, except it was much more rudimentary in its obsession with the potential for neuroses, right? Like, at this stage in midlife, depression, anxiety, and what the word they used was silly, but it basically just meant like a loss of meaning. And then they said the person's reaction of this was because of the realization that they began to look old. Right? Like they're wrinkly and their beard is starting to gray, and their stamina, this is repeatedly said, is their stamina, which is measured by, I don't know what or which stamina they're talking about. Is it sexual or is it actually like their sports? Because I don't think many people are fucking athletic in this country, so I don't know what they're talking about. But they say that, and then they're like, oh, to recalibrate towards the second stage of life so that it's fun. Because otherwise it's depressing, right? It's depressing. So to recalibrate so that it's fun, you must go do fun things, which is affairs are fun, and then sports cars are fun. That's, and I'm like, dude, that's not my idea of fun, right?
No.
Like, it legitimately, I got a different view of what fun is, but that was that guy's description. And so it kind of like was starting out in the direction you're going, and then it just goes, okay,
Yeah.
This is now, big boys, it's time to have fun so you don't feel old, and sad.
Yeah.
And that's like the description of a midlife crisis in a lame way.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably something to that, but I think that's too simplistic. What's your give me your kind of take on it? How do you think of midlife crisis?
It's unbelievable how weird my concept of the midlife crisis goes, because I've seen people hit a crisis at 16, at 24, at 40, at 60, and many of them are really similar, and I kind of actually drift to a Jungian model, which I know that you typically don't think of me as a Jungian, but in this case, the like grips, and now I'm going to end up in the stupid cycle, right? Here's my depiction of the Jungian myth and or the Jungian story of the phenomenon. So it's like, as you grow into this calcified identity of a human, of a personality and its persona, you kind of collect things about you that are accurate and some that are pretty much disinformation. Like you think you're better than you are, you think you're worse than you are, whatever. And so you end up with this identity, and it reaches some type of a crescendo that it can no longer tolerate anymore. And at some point, the dark night grips you, and starts to pull you into, well, I don't know. The Dark Knight actually is down here. So something grips you, and this, I may need your help with this, but because normally I know the story very well. And it pulls you down into this kind of a gravity, which actually there's like a an actual psychic, almost like a parameter, or like a psychic membrane. It literally like a psychic membrane from which the psyche emerges. It's getting sucked back into this membrane, and as it goes through the membrane, certain parts of yourself are shed. And this is where the Dark Knight experience happens, where you have that like serious, this is an actual crisis. And the other thing of like, oh, I feel a little anxious and depressed and I'm not sure what I am, and so now I need some strippers and cocaine. It's like, no, this is different. This is like you're pulled in and nothing can save you, as you have to shed these parts of your identity that are somehow not universally true.
Yep.
Now, the people at this point might be like, what the hell are you talking about? Because this hasn't happened to me. Well, I've seen it happen at 16 and on and on and on, right?
Yep. Well, and I think anyone who says that it hasn't happened to them, that's just because they're in resistance to this deeper spiritual truth you're talking about. But people can resist it by just like turning off their psyche or drinking a ton or becoming super ADHD and consuming themselves with other things. So it's possible to resist it for a while, but the more and longer you resist it, the more and longer your health, both physical health and psychological health, just deteriorates. But you can resist it.
Yeah, exactly. You can resist it, and then at some point you can't. And then you end up having to go see the shrink because you think you're losing your mind.
Yeah, but even then, lots of times people go see the shrink, and the shrink could either be the talk therapist or the psychiatrist prescribing medication, or the voodoo doctor or the acupuncturist, the shrink, and there lots of times people are still trying to resist it. It's like, do you have some medication that can make these symptoms go away? Or do you have some CBT techniques to help me get my life back on track? And any doctor who's not a depth psychologist will probably try to help them resist it. It's only the depth psychological therapists that are like, hey buddy, you're in the midst of a depth rebirth process, and I'll like help you dive down deep and shed the shit that you need to shed so that you can be reborn and come up again as a new person.
Yeah, to come up as whatever this next phase or stage of your life is.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think that my perspective of what a midlife crisis is quite different than stereotypical.
I think I really like what you said. I think what you said totally fits perfectly what I said, but you just paid extra attention to the like deeper spiritual roots. I was talking about the more superficial, observable things, but I think the two things go together. And I blame you for opening this can of worms, but I'm now going to follow you down into this can of worms to connect what you said and what I said. There's this worldview, which Carl Jung and really a lot of people who I think are like the great spiritual thinkers see, is that what life is, what human life is, and sorry, but I gotta add in, and including before death and after death and in past lifetimes or future lifetimes, however we want to think about those, is a constant process of evolution and growth and change. And we're here on this planet to do something spiritual, psychological, emotional, creative, artistic. And so we kind of have a mission, and there's sort of things we need to do. And when we're born into this world, no one's ever going to get it perfect. And so when we start getting off course, symptoms, pain, difficulty are almost the signs that we're off course. And so when we're off course, the symptoms are telling us we're off course. And if we're going off course, eventually we're going to have to kind of crash and burn and go down into the underworld and shed the stuff that was not what we were supposed to be doing, and go through a symbolic ego death, so that hopefully we can be reborn and try to like do a new journey. And also, I don't even want to say necessarily off course. Sometimes I just think it, and that's why I used the before death and after death. It's sort of like, imagine a person who is born and lives their life exactly how their spiritual destiny intended. Still, they're supposed to be born, do their thing, like do their great whatever spiritual, artistic, crazy thing, and then they're supposed to die. And then they die, and then they come up again. And that cycle is an archetypal cycle that we could talk about it a literal birth and death, or we could talk about it as a birth and death that happens a few times within one person's life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I can't tell you how many pathways what you're talking about just sends my mind into. Well, with that, I'm not even going to interject, because I literally was going to respond in a way that was like, well, shit, man, the fact that you're pointing towards getting off track, which then you corrected yourself and you were like, well, maybe it's not off track, because it is kind of like the psychic and physiological sensations of not being in alignment with whatever your actual destiny is, then points to the fact that there is a destiny. Yep. And this is something that lots of people are going to argue against. They'll say, like, there's no such thing as a destiny. We don't have this, like, what are you talking about? That would mean that then each of us have a path, and then what is the path? What is the path? Can't you tell me the path? Write out the thing that the path is, because no one appears to know what the path is. Yep. Which is a divergence from the American dream, the American story. The American story, as you just made it so clear with the white picket fence in the very beginning, and then all of a sudden here we are in this different kind of, it's the same conversation that suddenly looks slightly like, hey, wait a second, no, they're like, that's good enough at one point, but somewhere along the lines, whether you're 16 and having a full revelation that, oh my God, what my parents aspired to be is not what I would like to be. The world from which I was born is not the one that I want to live in. And so then, whenever that revelation occurs to someone, and with it comes the, disillusionment almost, right? The disillusionment of, hey, I got a nice ride here. I got this plan that looks good. And it's like, no, fall from grace. Totally. Into the abyss. And then from there emerges, and that's why the idea of a midlife crisis is always a story of distress. It's always a story of, like, it's silly, it's shameful, it's like, oh, that's a guy acting the fool. And no one ever understands that, yes, it does look funny as you go into and you plummet into your uncertainty again, looking like a teenager trying to find your identity. It does look funny. It's funny watching a dude, like a 50-year-old dude with a ponytail and a Corvette trying to drive around with some hot blonde chick. That's fucking funny, right? And everyone's seen that, unbelievably, right? And I said that I was going to yell if somebody said that again, and it was me who said it. Fuck. Okay, so. But
the reason it, quote, looks funny or people criticize that is, imagine the peanut gallery of people criticizing the guy going through the midlife crisis. That peanut gallery is the status quo American society, and what they think is that a person should just be a good boy and follow the plan. And so then when they see someone doing anything different, when someone is deviating from the script, they're like, oh, that you're deviating from the script, that's bad, you're not supposed to be doing that. The status quo peanut gallery of people, we Americans don't get that part of life is supposed to be the crash down and the diving down into the underworld. If we understood that, then the peanut gallery would be like, wow, this guy's going through that profound threshold of death rebirth. Like, that's so amazing. I can't wait to see what kind of regeneration he comes up with.
Yeah, that would be really cool to kind of support friends and family going through that, instead of just like get into this, alarming, hey, you have the disease, get him away from us, which it's very much like appropriate with today's kind of like disease resistance and or disgust of the other today, right? It's like, clearly when somebody starts to depict these classical signs, which when you look up midlife crisis, the immediate thing they say is like, how do you know if it's happening, right? What are the signs? And it's like, because everyone wants to know what are the signs so they don't have to have it. Like, oh, it's happening to him. It's happening. There it is. He has it, not me. Look, he has he has the secret COVID whatever it is. And it's like, clearly put on a mask. If we could wear fucking masks to make it go away, we would do it.
Totally. What are the signs? The signs are driving in a sports car with a hot young chick. And what are the preventions? Eat lots of spinach. Okay, I'm going to eat spinach every night to try to avoid having the midlife crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, what's really fascinating, I think, is that the midlife crisis was typically a male thing. It was like what guys went through. And now, predominantly, the world of midlife crisis is dominated by women. Mm-hmm. You probably didn't know that, but I did my fucking research. And I literally went to look at midlife crisis podcasts, and 100% of the podcasts on Apple Podcasts are women.
Yeah.
They're women talking about women, and then they mix in menopause as part of the process. So that happens at 51. So apparently female midlife crisis is scheduled to be at 51, right? Due to some hormonal thing, but then of course men were like, shut up, we have menopause too. Men have menopause because it's true. Like we have cascading problems of decline in testosterone, and so since women's is closely related to their sex hormones, then guys are like, oh well, we have a hormone-related thing that is also related to our psyche. So it's almost like midlife crisis is something of a physiological happening as you age, and then, you get wrinkles. And it's like, yeah, dude, I started to have wrinkles when I was like 25, right? Yeah. So if I was going to freak out about myself looking old, I think I had this big forehead when I was like born, right? So I was like, I should have had the idea that I was going to look older. I kind of looked this old when I was 25, and I still look this old, right? Like, slight variations, but I think I looked old early on.
And so, yeah, a lot of people are talking about fear of death, which I'm sure that's part of it. I shouldn't deny that that's part of it. But I feel like if your life and psyche is hooked into a meaningful, inspiring trajectory, and you're on a life path that like works for you, I don't think fear of death is a thing. Well, it's always a thing, but I don't think it will tank you down into a midlife crisis. And then the other topic we should mention, because we don't hardly have any time left, is relationships. Romantic relationships, I think, are oftentimes part of midlife crises. And the really short version is that what you're, quote, supposed to do in our culture is get married and live happily ever after. And I think that the reality is that almost no relationships follow the path of live happily ever after. And so if that's the expectation, and the reality is relationships don't do that, I think that oftentimes creates a midlife crisis too. Because when you fall in love and you're in the early stages, the relationship is so inspiring and gives you so much meaning and passion and joy. And then after a few years, as that dies down, and then eventually the relationship, oftentimes people start to feel like they're prisons or balls and chains. And I think that's oftentimes part of a midlife crisis too.
Dude, some people actually believe that only 1 in 4 adults actually experience midlife crisis, and that midlife crisis is brought on by divorce. That's an actual model.
Wow.
Right? So it clearly is completely whacked compared to what we're talking about, and or it's in some different reality. But it directly is like focused entirely on this aspect that you're talking about.
Well, yeah, the fact that that's a model just shows to me how misunderstood what midlife crisis is. And then now, as I'm thinking, and as you bringing up women, the other thing we'd have to think about is not the stereotypical prison of marriage and married. It's sort of like there's a married with children prison that leads to midlife crisis, and then the midlife crisis leads to divorce. That guy's got the cart before the horse in his model. But then the other thing is people who can't find a romantic relationship and partnership, which is a hugely growing segment of the population, especially women. There's a 30-something, 40-something, like wildly common crisis of women trying to find a relationship and they can't do it. And that leads to a certain midlife crisis of sorts too.
Oh my God, absolutely. It's so clear that if we were to properly investigate this phenomenon, we need to do this in like 5 different chapters.
Totally.
To do this any service, really. We should break it up into the aspects, because we didn't even get into how much our world is obsessed with various groups and their experience of because what we're talking about is a universal human experience known as a midlife crisis, which then is not only something that is terrifying and is experienced as psychological and physically difficult, but then afterwards there is room for it becoming something regenerative and awesome. Mm-hmm. So the story isn't complete if you just focus on, it's a silly thing where you start to feel old and you do funny things to feel young. It's like, nah, that's not good enough, because it turns out, well, then, like, if it's different for women and for men, I know we're not supposed to point out such differences, but there are people already proudly announcing the difference between gay men having a midlife crisis instead of straight men, right? That's a huge thing, especially coming from San Francisco. There's one of the authors that I read was actually a gay dude in San Francisco, announcing that rather than go to get a sports car, he got really into redecorating. And I was like, dude, don't be so stereotypically gay. That's silly. Right? I mean, that's because it's making the sports car guy stereotypically straight. Like, I know a gay dude who got a fucking yellow Porsche, for a canary yellow Porsche in his midlife crisis. So don't tell me that's for straight men and the other thing's for gay men. It's silly. In the same way, there's like actual publications about black men's midlife crisis.
Oh.
That's different, apparently. Oh. And then I was like, oh, really? Well, what about trans midlife crisis?
Right.
Oh, that's a thing too. Trans crisis, right? Like, well, you can't say trans crisis, because, well, the moment you have the revelation that you are trans, isn't that a type of a crisis? But then, do you also go through this type of crisis of meaning as you mature?
Yeah.
Is that the umbrella we're talking about? It's like a crisis of individual psychic physical maturity.
Yeah, totally.
And finding a story that then supports your experience. Yep. Your individual lived experience, because I can't relate to the trans women, gay dude thing. I need one that fits kind of my experience.
Yeah.
I need one like that. So, I guess where do we go from here?
I don't know. As you were saying that, here's where my mind went. You said you need a story, but as you were talking just now, I was envisioning like a house. Like in the first few decades of our life, we start building a house to live in, and you build it all up and get it all nice, and you're done building your house. And then you're like, wait a minute, I don't really want to live in this particular house anymore. And then but you've spent your whole life building that house. What the hell are you going to do? And so to leave that house or to demolish that house seems like a giant mistake. Like, oh my God, that idiot, he spent 40 years building that house and now he's going to move out of it? Like, that's devastating, horrible thing. He fucked up. He's bad.
Yes, I like that.
But the reality is that's just what happens. It's almost just like when you're a kid and you build a Lego house, and then when you're done, what do you got to do? Rip it apart and build a new one.
Totally. And when you see kids and they've got like finished built Lego things on their shelves in their room, I'm like, didn't you get the memo, bro? Dude. Then you have to it was a really strange thing when my son had that experience, because he built a few of them, and then one day he came and he was like, let's smash these. And so he wanted to make this whole YouTube channel of him smashing the Lego sets. And he had one really silly one that someone gave him for his birthday, like My Little Pony. And so he wanted to have like this dark scene of him smashing it with a bat.
I remember that YouTube channel. It was titled Does It Smash?
Yeah, exactly. It's really a... But when you point towards the grown-up pursuit of building and achieving in this world, and then to think like, oh, well, yeah, along the way you build something, and then you're like, oh, I don't really want to live here and or live in this career that I've built.
Right.
And so you might want to change. You don't want to do this career anymore, and you have this kind of a family dynamic, and you can't seem to make it work for this next stage, and so you're like, I don't really want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And if you can't get it to move with you towards your new vision, so there must be some element of an emerging vision.
Yep.
You think so?
Well, I think that what the human soul is it's a force that is always generating new visions and new trajectories. And that is problematic in the context of the human life that wants structure and to build a house and to stay in the house and to live happily ever after. Those two things are at odds. And we'd like to deny that the human soul is going to come up with new visions, but tough shit. It's going to do it, and it's going to fucking burn down your house.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. You know what? The story keeps going, and we don't have time to keep going, because it's like you look at there's a psychic process that seems to be guided by this like larger within the world process, and you look at like what is it like to become 45 in today's world? Today's world is seriously more screwed up than other times, but then not really. Because if you look at like, what about the guys who turned 45 in the middle of World War II, right? In the middle of Europe's devastation.
Yep.
Right? Like okay, yeah, that's kind of a weird time to have gone through this stage.
Yep.
And then so you see the rise of European existentialism as an obvious reaction to that in a movement that's substantial.
Yeah.
Right? And not to say that, that was a midlife thing, because those guys weren't even in midlife, right? Not exactly, but then again, I'm not even going to bother to look into whether Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre and all those fucking guys were of midlife at the time when certainly they maintained this status until they were old, so whatever. When they came up with these ideas, but then again, it's like, I'm just like looking at the historic and like external societal influences that would contribute to this versus this internal thing where they talk about hormones and stuff, but you and I have gamed the hormones and the physical aging, and as we're training for a Spartan race, it's like stamina. Dude, I'm pretty much more fit than I was when I was 26.
Totally. I'm the fittest I've ever been in my life.
Fucking crazy when you start to hijack your nutrition and your training specifically,
Yep.
and you rest properly, and like look at what my dad has done with like hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah, totally.
Like,